Story number 1. I didn't go looking for the uncanny. I only wanted a Sunday out where the limestone walls smell like rain and chalk. I thought teachers were anchors, unshakable, loud, and safe. By noon, the anchor would drag us all into a dark river. Here's the first truth. The terror wasn't cold stone or dripping ceilings. It was certainty in a man's eyes. And the second truth, certainty can be the cruelest ghost. I grew up in England, the kind of north that prefers to mind its own business. Our coach rolled into Yorkshire, and the gorge opened like a tilted jaw. I'd read the brochure, I'd traced the map, I even circled the words House Gorge in my notebook just to feel prepared. Tom Taylor Cave was the star of the day, whispered up by older students as if the stone could keep secrets indefinitely. We were a small pack of Year 7 who thought matching waterproofs could make us explorers. Our leader was Mr. Fisher, the geography teacher, with a bark of a laugh and a beard that looked like it had its own lesson plan. He shared the duty roster with Mrs. Jones, the PE teacher whose whistle could persuade thunder to relocate. The itinerary was clipped to a plastic board. The rules were obvious. Stay with the group. Keep helmets on in the cave. No wandering near the water. The things that break you rarely appear on a rule sheet. Only a few minutes in, I sensed that something about Mr. Fisher had shifted sideways. He flinched when the cafe door scraped. He stared too long at families passing us on the path. He kept counting our heads with the frantic focus of a lifeguard in a storm. I chalked it up to vigilance until he pulled me and 2 mates aside and said, in the same tone teachers use to assign homework, that someone in our group might not be who he seemed. He glanced at Jason. Jason, who was average on purpose, who laughed the way boys do when the wind cuts through the trees. Keep an eye on him, Fisher said, like it was a secret badge we should be proud to wear. The word them kept slipping out of his mouth without a clear destination. Them on the cliff path, them near the steps, them passing in twos. He never named them, only built their outline, and fear colored in the rest. By the time we reached the information board about mining, he gave the outline its name. Gangs talking, he said, testing the syllables as though they might sting him. He described a grid of strangers organized to harass a single person until that person twisted into something else. He said there were signs: dark glasses indoors, head coverings, phones angled at the wrong time. He described signals, lookouts, surveillance. He told us there were targeted individuals. He told us a targeted individual could be hidden in plain sight, that some of us might already be marked, that if things turned bad, we'd need to move quickly and trust only him. Even now, I can feel the air go thin, remembering that speech. I didn't have a word yet for what he carried. but I had a feeling. If belief is a bridge, his was missing a span. We were scheduled for the Tom Taylor cave tour with an official guide. But when we reached the gate, Fisher waved the idea away and let us in himself. The cave accepted us with a damp breath and swallowed our chatter. The path was fenced by a low metal rail, the floor firm but slick. Water beaded on helmets, gathered on jacket cuffs, traced our knuckles. We funneled through, and the world became limestone and echo. Except the echoes were not of sound, but of warnings he kept whispering in our ears. He told me to watch a couple in hiking boots, 2 switchbacks ahead. He told my friend to track a man by the steps. He told us that if Jason acted up, we should intervene decisively. He used a different phrase with me: use reasonable force. And the word reasonable hung in the air like a cracked light bulb. I didn't know that a phrase could be a cliff edge. I didn't know that being 11 makes cliffs look like puzzles and not consequences. The cave widened into a chamber where a plaque explained the old mining. We gathered by the sign. Across the chamber, a woman stood still as a matchstick in a jar, a rain poncho draped over her hair, sunglasses smudged by cave light. That's when our teacher took belief and used it like a blade. He leaned to us, voice as low as a secret code. She's one of them. A hand radioed to the surface, a helicopter waiting to rise. Coordinates traded from lamp to sky. He pictured a net so intricate it glittered. It might be polite to say, doubt tugged at me. Truth, fear tugged. Not of the woman, of the certainty in him. He moved faster than the cave could slow him, crossed to her, grabbed her wrists. It happened quietly, the way a wet rope slips. His questions battered the air. Where were her people? What was the plan at the exit? The woman's mouth fell open. Her whole body went rigid. Offense and shock braided together. A man hurried over. No emblem, no badge, just the kind of decision one stranger makes in defense of another. He asked Mr. Fisher to step back. He promised to call the police. He said it in a tone that assumed we all still lived in the same reality. Our teacher smiled like a man who has found the center of a maze. Good, he said. Call them. They won't reveal themselves. And I watched the Good Samaritan's face change. He recognized something. The tilt of sympathy is subtle. He softened his voice, reached with care, tried to coax our teacher away from the woman and back to us. That tender pivot, compassion rather than confrontation, should have worked. Maybe in another timeline, it did. In ours, compassion became the mask of a gangstalker. That was how Mr. Fisher read it, out loud, for all of us to hear. And then he seized the man by the jacket and drove him into the rail. The impact shuddered the metal. The man sank. Shock first, pain following. Our teacher stepped forward with purpose and began to kick. I can recount every detail, but details feel like indulgence when the point was helplessness. We were children, and the person trusted to stand between us and danger had become the danger. A wave of adults rushed in. Tourists, a staff member whose badge caught the lamp glow and tore our teacher away. Every second lasted the length of a minute. The cave accepted all of it. The pleas, the breath, the scuff of boots. When it was over, no one lay still, but nobody felt whole. The chamber had witnessed a small end of a world and did not bother to change its drip. They guided us out in subsets, counting us again and again, like numbers could sew reality shut. At the mouth of the cave, daylight felt wrong, soft and bright and obviously indifferent. Someone found Mrs. Jones out on the lake with the canoe group, and she came back hard-eyed, listening, quick, gathering names, triaging shock. I waited for sirens that never came. I waited for explanations that don't exist. We rode the coach home with an empty seat where the beard and bark should have been. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, rehearsing the same two truths. First truth. Again, the scariest thing is not a dark corridor. It's a conviction that won't break even when reality asks it to. Second truth. The mind you trust can turn, and it willn't announce the hour. At school, the rumors multiplied the way rumors do when adults speak in low hallways. Mr. Fisher is gone. He's in a home. It was early onset something. I learned to hold gossip at arm's length, but one detail kept circling back from older students. Long before our trip, he had talked about gangs talking in class, as if it were geography. A pattern of roads and sightlines, a map only he could read. Maybe he had carried that map for years. Maybe the cave only gave it a stage. I found myself thinking about Jason, about how easily a normal boy had become a suspect in someone else's storm. When you're 11, adults write your borders. If an adult says you're a target, you look for the mark on your skin. If an adult says you're dangerous, you glance at your hands. Kids don't know what to do with impossible instructions like use reasonable force, except pretend they're brave enough to obey. That pretending could have burned a life. We were lucky the fire took a different path. There are practical aftershocks, meetings, forms, safeguarding protocols, long conversations with people trained to ask kind questions. But trauma doesn't sign the visitor book. It softens the floorboards under ordinary days. I kept replaying the woman's glasses, the man's careful voice, the crack in the teacher's certainty that never actually cracked. Each replay led to the same unspooled thought. If a mind can betray its owner, how do the rest of us plan our exits? I started reading in private, not forums that turn fear into a hobby, but articles about delusion and misperception, about how pattern recognition, the gift that lets humans find constellations, becomes a weapon when expectation replaces evidence. I wasn't diagnosing Fisher. I had no right to. I was trying to give my 11-year-old heart a railing sturdier than the one in the cave. What I learned didn't comfort me so much as make the ground honest. A belief can take you hostage. It can provide relief from chaos by offering a story in which every coincidence is a clue. It can make kindness look like camouflage and concern look like a trap. Once you're inside that story, a boy like Jason is never just a boy. A poncho is never just dry hair. A pair of sunglasses is a radio that never stops speaking. Evidence doesn't refute the story because the story has already accounted for the evidence. That's the closed circle I saw in Mr. Fisher's eyes. Not anger, but completion. The day after the trip, I walked past his empty classroom. The wall map of the UK still hung under the whiteboard, the kind with counties blushing in different colors. A stack of field trip forms sat neatly clipped. On his desk, a mug with a cartoon compass that said, "Find your bearings." I wanted to take that cup and throw it into the car park. Instead, I stood there and practiced a sentence out loud. It wasn't my fault. Kids collect guilt like badges. They think good intentions can neutralize consequences. They think laughing along makes them accomplices. We had played at being his lieutenants. We had taken pride in being noticed. That pride curdled into helplessness in a matter of minutes. I keep returning to what didn't happen. Jason wasn't hurt. The woman went home with a story that will bend family dinners for years. But she went home. The man stood up, bruised and disbelieving, and walked himself toward the surface. We did not witness a death. I count those as mercies, not excuses. Sometimes, when the hour is late and the house is quiet, I inventory the scene as if it were evidence locked in a bag. House, gorge, the stone narrowing until light becomes an afterthought. Tom Taylor, cave, the board about mining, the rail, the lamps, Mrs. Jones, distant on the lake, a whistle that didn't reach us, Jason, a boy who never knew he was a suspect. Mr. Fisher, a man whose certainty outlived its usefulness. The list is ordinary until it isn't. That's how memory protects and exposes at the same time. What would I say if I could stand in front of him now? Not a lecture. Lectures are scaffolding, and he didn't need to be repaired in front of me. Maybe I'd offer the thing he tried to offer us. Permission. You're allowed to lay the map down. You're allowed to ask for a different story. You are still a teacher to me. The part that broke doesn't cancel the lessons you once gave about rocks and rivers and how landscapes are made by pressure over time. I won't pretend I'm noble. For months after, every time a stranger raised a phone near me in a queue, my chest tightened. The story he gave me wanted to use me, too. But I learned a practice that felt like washing a wound. Assume error before malice. A lens darkens indoors because lenses darken. A hood protects hair because damp means chill. People stand near you because paths narrow. The world is a busy place, not a rigged one. When I visit Yorkshire now, and yes, I've gone back, I walk the top path first. I look down where the gorge snakes, and I practice naming the obvious. Tree, rail, wet rock, families, guides with torches. Words can be rails you build for yourself. I carry two truths the way you carry water, not to drown in, but because thirst makes you reckless. First truth, terror is certainty. Second truth, the mind is not a fortress, it's a village, and villages need help when fires start. Before I leave, I lean over and say a quiet apology to the cave that saw us at our worst. I don't know if stone accepts apologies, but I do know this. On the day I learned what a broken belief can do, I also learned what people can do. Unknown men who step in, staff who move fast, friends who count heads, a Mrs. Jones who returns to shore, a coach driver who waits as long as it takes. There's a third truth tucked between the other two. When one story betrays you, borrow a kinder one until you can make your own. And Jason? He messaged me years later. He works near a canal, takes his lunch on the steps, sometimes brings a book on geology, because once upon a time, a teacher taught him to love rocks. He doesn't remember the cave the way I do. That, too, is mercy. Story number 2. 5 minutes is enough to wreck a future. I learned that in a museum where the air tasted like chalk and guilt. I used to believe fear was a costume. That day, I learned it can be bone deep, older than language. Some doors say staff only, because what's behind them can't survive the public, nor the public survive them. I thought I was a clever kid. I was just a loaded switch looking for a dark room. If there's a curse in this world, it's the kind that keeps you alive long enough to remember every second of the worst thing you did. I'm telling this straight, as the man I am now. But the night kept my 13-year-old voice. When me and my buddy Craig were younger, we did a terrible thing. Names changed to protect the not-so-innocent, etc. I won't varnish it. I won't plead innocence. Back then, I believed trouble was something you could outrun. Now, I understand it keeps pace at a walk and waits by every mirror. I can say this much without drama. Y'all have every right to hate me for what follows. It started with a field trip that wasn't on any official calendar. It was a small suburban museum that never got the good stuff. The kind of place that padded the gift shop with rubber scarabs and paper crowns. Our English teacher, Mr. Barker, was our English teacher, volunteered to take a handful of us on a Saturday. Why an English teacher for an Egypt exhibit? I thought it was quirky. Adults get hobbies, I figured. I did not read the tremor beneath his smile, or the way his eyes kept skipping the sarcophagi like stones across a lake. The exhibit itself felt like a school play wearing makeup. Sand poured into plexiglass trays, painted gods with movie star teeth. Not many real people are deathly afraid of mummies. We weren't studying dynasties. We were just bored kids orbiting glass. Craig elbowed me at the canopic pots, and I whispered that a dead vizier would come looking for his liver. He rolled his eyes, and we drifted on, snickering at the spirit. Halloween crocodile slumped in a corner, while a tiny placard confessed it was only for display. Then we wandered past the ropes, where adult voices thin out. There was a gray door with a cheap brass hasp and a paper tag that read "Staff Only." The lock hung on the outside like a dare, the kind adults leave without thinking, because adults forget how gravity treats children. I lifted the sign and slid it into my backpack, just to prove I had a spine. Beyond the threshold, the room smelled like tape, warm dust, and metal, fluorescents humming, a metal table, lamps on counterweighted arms. At the far wall, tilted like a warning, an open sarcophagus with an actual mummy reclining inside. The gallery mummies had glass and distance. This one had air. On one side, the wrappings were unrolled and pinned with neat little clips. A brown crescent of skin showed through, fine as parchment. The dead has a way of shrinking the room around it. I felt it and still kept walking. Awe lasted 30 seconds. Stupidity took the wheel after that. We ran for Barker because he was the kind of adult who let us write about monsters and didn't bleed red ink over the margins. If anyone would grin at a forbidden discovery, it would be him. We found him by a painted false door, the nurse hovering nearby with a brochure. I blurted that we'd found a stray relic in a workroom, an abandoned curse in plain sight. He swallowed once, the way you do before a roller coaster drops, and followed us back at the door. Craig and I lurked in the frame. The air in there had a taste. Glue, ancient cloth, something like dry flowers kept too long behind a church. Barker stepped in with his shoulders squared against the room. He reached out, paused, and touched cloth with 2 fingers. Then skin. Reverent, apologetic. You don't realize you're watching a private ceremony until the officiant looks frightened. We did the thing anyway. We shut the door and latched it, pulled the door shut and latched it. The sound was small, but the moment it made was not. For a breath, he didn't notice. He studied the body like a student who finally understands a line of poetry. Then he turned. The handle refused him. The quiet snapped. He struck the door with his palm. Then both fists, hammering and banging as if air was a bargain the room had reneged on. We flattened ourselves into the shadows of a painted procession of gods, and every heartbeat felt like it belonged to someone else. What I didn't understand then, the room wasn't small. His fear was, some people faint at needles, some at dogs. Barker had a different map of danger, and we had locked him inside its borders. Through the little window, we watched him stagger to the sarcophagus. He gripped the shoulders of the wrapped figure and said something I could not hear. Then he lifted and drove the body toward the glass. The mummy hit and slid out of sight. Craig's fingers dug crescents into my wrist. Our brains sprinted ahead to the future where cops ask questions and parents practice disappointment in a mirror. 10 minutes. That's how long the world tilted. 10 minutes of furniture scraping, of Barker appearing and disappearing in the window like a storm seen between trees, of the wrapped shape turning from relic to shield to battering ram. Then a hush dropped over everything, heavy as a stage curtain. A custodian jogged past. A curator arrived with keys and sensible shoes. Voices braided together in policies. The lock turned. The room looked like an aftermath nobody had planned for. Torn bits of bandages scattered like confetti from a parade that should never have existed. Resin dust frosting the lino. A face that hadn't seen anyone in 3,000 years. Now seeing too much. Barker stood next to the sarcophagus, trembling like a man who had made it to shore and found the land moving. He looked at me. There was a roll call in that stare. The boy who closed a door. The man he might become. The ledger opened between them. Then he folded at the waist and emptied himself. It wasn't lunch. It wasn't bile. It was older, darker, a black liquid laced with dust that made the curator step back with her hand over her mouth. The nurse steadied him. He didn't wipe his chin. He kept his eyes on me, as if some delicate bell inside him had been struck and would not stop ringing. A staffer saw our faces and softened hers. "Probably mummy dust," she said, and gave the speech about spores and ventilation and masks and how you don't handle the old without teaching it how to leave you. Probably is a poor gatekeeper. Fear had found a way to get out. The body had found a way to refuse it. The rest came in like a neat little memo that never learned to blush. The big deal exhibit, mostly replicas and props designed to impress donors. the workshop's prize? Not royalty, not history that could survive the light. It was a trainer's dummy, built on an unclaimed, legally acquired corpse, real human bone and skin under modern wrappings. We hadn't watched a king get torn apart. We'd watched a teacher meet his private catastrophe beside a dressed-up body. Mercy learned to imitate paperwork that afternoon. The museum preferred the phrase incident. The school preferred boys will be boys. I confessed so fast, I tripped over the words. And they sat my confession in a corner and patted it on the head. A counselor called it a typical schoolboy prank, as if the door had been cardboard, as if those minutes didn't sit on anyone's lungs. Barker disappeared into extended leave. Maybe he stopped dreaming for a while. Maybe he dreamed only in linen and gravel. I never saw him again. Craig and I graduated to larger hallways with brighter lights and learned to walk around our shadows. On a social network, decades later, Craig types, "We were the worst kids ever," and I let it stand, because some sentences are truer as punishment than as fact. If there's a curse attached to me, it doesn't whisper in ancient tongues. It lives in certain doors I do not close, certain rooms I do not enter, certain windows I cannot look through without feeling watched from the other side. It lives in the knowledge that locks should never be placed where they catch a person's fear and hold it like an animal in a trap. It lives in the quiet of men who would rather cover a wound than stitch it. Years after, I tried to find Barker. The pre-internet fog swallowed the trail. Even his first name slipped away, my brain sanding down a sharp edge to keep me from cutting myself open every time I remembered. But the look he gave me is preserved in amber. When I think of it, my ribs feel like a gallery where the lights dim and a motion sensor clicks on to greet the only exhibit I can't stop revisiting. So here's my inventory, honest and unsorted. We were kids. We were careless in the way kids are before the world teaches them perimeter. We stole a sign. We sealed a room. A man faced a private storm. A body, modern wearing ancient, broke. A community chose story over justice. Years hardened around the silence. That's what I carry. A traveling display that sets itself up behind my sternum whenever the night goes museum quiet. If you want the moral, take this one. I don't believe in curses. I believe in systems. Locks where there should be none. Panic with nowhere to run. Adults scrubbing names instead of truths. The rest is wrapping. And wrapping is only there to keep us from touching what we've already done. Story number 3. Some doors don't hide secrets. They blur them until you walk closer. When the glass finally gave way, the truth was sharp enough to cut me open. A text from Dylan turned my spine into ice. Help. Authority can be a mask. That day, I tore one off with a red canister in my hands. If love is a promise, mine was simple. Get him out. No matter what breaks, I used to think the late afternoon light made our tiny school look generous. It softened the rust on lockers and washed the posters into gentle pastels, the kind that made you forget the building was a maze of rules. Back then, I was the girl walking home with the resident art prodigy. Dylan was the kind of beautiful people pretended not to notice and then watched in mirrors. We were ordinary, or so we told ourselves, because ordinary felt safe. He took art, while I dragged my clarinet case to band. We arranged our schedules like puzzle pieces, so our days clicked together. But that 1 hour separated us. It shouldn't have mattered. It did. One evening, hauling his sketchbook under his arm, he dropped a question that felt like a pebble thrown into the surface of us. What does "draw me like one of your French girls" mean? I laughed and told him the movie reference. It means "draw me nude." I expected him to smirk, to toss the line into the ditch with all the other high school jokes that died on the roadside. Instead, he looked past me, as if something on the horizon was calling his name. When I asked who said it, he shrugged, then fumbled, then changed the subject so hard it left skid marks. Later, he admitted the voice belonged to his new art teacher. The name carried its own gravity in our hallways. Miss Moy, young and magazine pretty, an accent borrowed from somewhere across the ocean, sleeves rolled to reveal paint-spattered forearms like she'd been baptized in color. Admiration hung around her like a perfume. So did a thin mist of envy. Teachers are supposed to move within bright lines. She didn't. At first, I treated the whole thing like a joke that wouldn't sit still. "How was art today?" I'd ask, tilting casual into sharp. "Any French commissions on the board?" He'd smile without landing it, a smile that looked like a door propped open with a shoe. I began to time my exits from band so I could drift past the art room as class ended. The windows were frosted, turned into pale squares of secrecy. You couldn't see inside. You could only see yourself arriving. One afternoon, I reached the doorway early. The class had already melted away. The door hadn't closed all the way, and air carried the gentle shapes of voices, her praise, his stammer, a tone that made my neck heat. I didn't need to see to understand the pose, not on a chair or a stool, but on a line of power. She asked whether he'd considered her portrait commission outside school hours. And something in the phrasing put my heart on the tile floor. He told me everything later, under the drone of cicadas in the park, while our friends kicked at gravel and pretended not to grin at the word commission. I watched their grins collapse when I said Dylan was 17. It's amazing how quickly people decide harm is hilarious when the target is a boy. He was relieved, I believed him, that I used the right words: boundary, pressure, wrong. Even before either of us knew how far that wrong wanted to go. From then on, We treated the art room like a weather system. I checked the forecast. He texted me when the barometer dropped. She'd float artistically, and then add a second meaning with a glance that slogged my stomach. Power is a corridor with a locked door at the end, and she had the keys. He kept choosing the hallway anyway, hoping to make it back out. That's the trick of coercion. It persuades you that leaving would be rude. The day everything tore open, my last class ran long. We were supposed to meet under the flag by the main doors. The courtyard was empty. No Dylan. Just the low breath of winter coming on. Inside, the halls had that end-of-day hush schools wear like a pressed suit. I passed the art room. Light glowed behind frosted panes. The knob wouldn't turn. My phone buzzed. I still remember the angle of my hand, the tilt of my wrist, the second before I knew my life had a fuse. I'm in art. She's undressing. Help. The world narrowed to the size of the text bubble. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. Thinking is slow, and doorways are fast. The vice principal turned the corner, and all I could get out was a word nobody ignores. Fire. I pulled the extinguisher from its bracket. The canister was heavier than fear. The first hit took the window in 3 obedient pieces, safety glass falling like 1,000 judgments. In the new opening, the scene breathed hard and real. She stood too close, confidence arranged like a pose, the authority of an adult used as a ladder to someone smaller. Dylan's chair was pressed back against the desk, his eyes locked on mine, relief and panic wrestling in the reflection. I climbed through the waist-high gap and leveled the nozzle. I didn't shout. I didn't play heroin. I simply chose the one tool the room gave me. The white surge leapt between us and pushed her sideways, the blast breaking the tableau into motion. Desks scraping, a phone skittering, the vice principal shouldering through the doorway. There are moments when you realize justice doesn't wear a robe. Sometimes it wears a sticker that says "Inspected" and lives in a red metal shell on the wall. Afterward, the town tried to sort the story into boxes labeled reason. People talked about stress and chemicals and first-year pressure. Paperwork moved. Evaluations were scheduled. We heard words like episode, like treatment, like policy. The line she crossed remained a line even when people tried to redraw the map. Dylan didn't sleep well for a while. He kept drawing, though he said it was the one language that hadn't lied to him. I learned something vicious and simple. When harm wears lipstick and says, "Afterwards we'll see what happens," people squint as if it's a magic trick instead of a threat. I learned, too, that love sometimes looks like cleaning glass out of your shoes and making sure the person you chose gets home. I kept the extinguisher powder under my nails for weeks, a consecration I didn't scrub away. Power met resistance. Resistance left residue. We grew older, and the frosted glass became a kind of shrine in my memory, not to pain, but to clarity. The world loves a glamorous villain until the bill arrives. The bill, as it turns out, was a 17-year-old boy who had been told he was lucky to be wanted. He wasn't lucky, he was targeted. The difference is a life. The school did what schools do when the foundations shake. Meetings, statements, reassignments, a reminder. Training everyone clicked through in silence, eyes sliding past fiber optic slides about appropriate boundaries. I held Dylan's hand through the parts that required telling, and he held mine through the parts that required listening. We learned how many people would rather not hold anything at all. He never asked me to be proud of him. I was anyway. He had said no, and then no again, and then reached for help instead of reaching for silence. I kept waiting to wake up and find a version of us that didn't have to know what we know. Then our lives did what lives must. They moved. College, a shoebox apartment, a second-hand dining table that wobbled when we laughed. Work that didn't care who we'd been in high school. He started doing digital art, learning to draw with light instead of chalk. He still keeps charcoal in a drawer, a small storm he can summon whenever the screen feels too clean. Sometimes he speaks to groups about consent and power. He doesn't name names. He names patterns. He tells them how a compliment can be a fishing line, how a private conversation can be a hallway leading to a room with frosted glass. He tells them about the message that changed everything. Help. He tells them that asking for it is not an apology. It's an action. When our daughter was born, sleep became currency, and love became gravity with manners. We taped a print of Dylan's over her crib, a still life of a red canister on a windowsill, a square of broken light falling across the label. People assumed it was abstract. It isn't. It's a promise disguised as an object. If she ever asks why we chose it, I will tell her, because rescue can be taught. We ran into the vice principal years later at a hardware store, the kind of place where help wears a green apron and no one speaks in policy. He recognized us immediately. He asked if Dylan was still drawing. He asked about the baby. He didn't ask about the teacher. We didn't volunteer the name. The past can be honored without being summoned every so often. Someone challenges the story. They use gentler verbs. They call it a misunderstanding, a crisis, a phase. They say boys don't suffer the same way girls do in these situations. They ask whether we exaggerated the danger. They want me to admit the glass was never that sharp. I tell them this: Glass always cuts. You just need to touch it long enough to see the blood. There's a version of this story strangers sometimes demand. The one where we ruin a person's life. The one where art becomes the villain. The one where everyone is either saint or monster. Real life is messier. It's also cleaner. We didn't ruin anyone. Choices did. Art isn't the villain. It's the witness. And people are rarely saints or monsters. They're doors. Some open toward safety. Some don't. I kept one more relic from that day. A small triangle of safety glass that slipped into my coat pocket when I climbed back through the window. It lives in a velvet bag in my desk drawer, transparent as memory. When the light hits it right, it fogs, as if trying to become frosted again. I hold it and remember how the room smelled, not of scandal, but of extinguished heat, of something dangerous cooling by force. If you want the moral written out, I can do that. It's not pretty, no matter your gender. If an adult in authority tries to make your body part of their classroom, step out of the lesson. Tell someone who will break a window if they have to. Tell two. Keep telling until the room fills with people who see you as human before they see you as a rumor. And if you are the person standing in the hallway, hearing the buzz of a phone turn into a plea, don't hesitate. Choose the tool on the wall. Choose the loud thing. Choose the action that leaves a mess. We still walk past schools sometimes, pushing a stroller, watching students pour into their futures with the awkward grace of learning humans. I always check the windows. Some are clear, some are frosted. I know better than to trust either. What matters is who stands on the other side, and whether the locked door belongs to the right person. Dylan reaches for my hand like he did when we were 17. A reflex older than doubt. He squeezes once, and I answer twice. That's our code. It means I'm here. It means you're safe. It means if the glass ever fogs again, I know which arm carries the fire. We keep our life simple on purpose. Too much ornament invites shadows. He draws at a clean desk near a window. I write at a table that no longer wobbles. Our daughter stacks blocks. The architecture of someone who believes gravity is optional. On the wall hang 3 frames: the red canister, a charcoal of our intertwined hands, a watercolor of a window with light spilling through. People ask whether it's the same window. I say it's every window. When the story resurfaces online, as stories do, I receive messages from men who sign only their first initial. They talk about coaches, bosses, mentors, neighbors, the slow lean of a trusted adult turning into a trap. They apologize for existing, as if being young at the wrong time were a sin. I tell them apologies are for the people who crossed the line, not the ones who refused to. I tell them that healing is not gratitude for survival. It's the insistence on a different ending. Dylan doesn't read most of the messages. He learned there's a cost to being everyone's mirror. Some days he pays it willingly, and some days he pockets his change and walks home early. I understand. We promised each other not to be brave all the time, because that's just another costume to get trapped in. We promised to be ordinary whenever ordinary felt like safety. We met the old band director at a reunion. He asked whether I still played. I told him I set the clarinet down when our lives got louder in different ways. He laughed softly and said, "Grown-up life is a score that keeps changing keys." Then he said the thing I didn't know I needed, that intervening isn't about heroics. It's about tempo. You step in at the right beat, and you keep the song from falling apart. I wrote it down later and taped it inside my desk drawer, next to the velvet bag. As for the teacher, I don't keep her name fresh. People think forgetting is mercy. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's maintenance. The point is the pattern, the corridor, the lock. The point is that power misused should meet friction every single time, whether that friction is a policy or a person holding a red canister. Once, our daughter asked about the framed canister. I told her it's a picture of a tool. She said, "Tools are for fixing things." I said, "Sometimes they're for stopping things." She thought about it, then nodded the solemn nod of a child absorbing a new shape of the world. She went back to building, stacking, failing, laughing, building again. That's the other part no one tells you. After the mess, you get to make things. I still dream about the frosted glass. In the dream, I'm always walking. The hallway is quiet. The light is wrong. The lock is stubborn. The text arrives like a bell without sound. I don't wake up in panic anymore. I wake up grateful, my hands remembering weight, my body remembering the square of a window frame, biting my thigh as I climb through. The dream ends the same way every time, with air full of white, and a boy standing up. If you need the neat bow, here it is. We married. We made a home. We put the extinguisher back on its bracket. We hope no one ever needs it. We also teach our neighbors how to pull the pin. Love is not a feeling. It's a readiness. It's the practiced habit of choosing the person you promised to choose, even when authority tells you to wait, to ask permission, to file a report. Sometimes you file the report. Sometimes you break the glass. Often you do both. And if you ever find yourself in a corridor watching light turn cloudy on a window, remember this: doors don't protect truth. People do. I was 17 when I learned that. I am older now and still learning. But if the day comes when the corridor calls my name again, I already know the shape my hands will make. They will reach, they will lift, they will aim, they will choose the loud thing, they will choose the mess, they will choose the person I love. Every time. Story number 4. I used to think the internet was a hallway of open doors, each room loud with someone else's life. That spring, I learned some rooms are quiet because the person inside is listening, not speaking. I learned it in the least cinematic place possible. Homeroom, under the smell of dry erase markers, where grown-ups are supposed to be airlocks against the mess of being young, not funnels. Before that season, gossip felt like chalk dust, annoying, weightless, gone with a breath. Then a page with no face gave it teeth. The first time I realized the page had my full name in its mouth. The world contracted to a white cursor, blinking like a pulse. It had been busy chewing on everyone else for months. It would be logical to say I should have seen it coming. Logic is poor company in a cafeteria. By the time I understood who had been feeding it, I had already made a promise I could not tell anyone about, and I was already old in a way that doesn't show on skin. Anyone remember LiveJournal? It was kind of like Tumblr, but back before Tumblr was a thing. I didn't live online back then. I lived at a desk by the door. I lived in the hour between last bell and dusk. I lived in the way adults said my name when they needed volunteers. But even I felt the ripple. It had a big goth and emo population. But in general, people would just use it to microblog about their problems, their day, their faves, music, and the people they hated. If you were 16 in 2004 in a town like mine, it was the weather in the spring of 2004. A live journal started getting shared around by some of my classmates. It began as a curiosity passed between sleeves during algebra, a link scribbled in the margin of a worksheet, a wink across the lunch line. The blog had been found by one student. I'll just call her Kate, who was a big live journal user. She dressed in black, the way some people wear armor. There was a post that caught her eye that she was sure was about her. She laughed about it in the way that meant she wanted to be seen laughing. We all turned toward the performance because that is what public school trains into you. Stage directions for surviving. The account posted as if it were a weather radio for cruelty. It named sins like forecasted rain, mapped mistakes as if they were storms migrating across our hallways. The anonymous tone was a kind of perfect, not angry, not shrill, just neutral enough to pass as fact while being poisonous. It felt less like a person writing and more like a blank wall that had learned how to speak. The next post that really caused a stir was the one that claimed Gertrude, a senior girl, had gotten an abortion. We all knew that wasn't her real name, and we knew the boy's name that came next, because the baby daddy was Jamal. who was not her boyfriend. Dirk. I remember the cafeteria as a theater in the round. Trays juddering, faces turning, the fluorescent lights hard as truth. The staged confrontation that followed was a mess of pride and panic. Ruin doesn't always look like ruin in real time. Sometimes ruin looks like being louder than you know how to be. That might have been the worst of it, if worst was only measured by volume. But then the page widened its appetite and reached where no loudmouth ever had. Now, the next one accused my favorite teacher, Miss Whitaker, of running over a dog when she was a teenager. I didn't want to click. We all clicked. The account had a way of saying things as if they had already been said somewhere else, as if it were merely collecting. That's what made it credible. In the ugliest sense of the word. A few days later, I had a private homeroom meeting with Mrs. Whitaker and asked her about the dog. I went because I couldn't stand watching a kind person be measured by a rumor. Her classroom was a sanctuary built out of posters for plays that had already happened and plays that never would. On the desk sat a coffee mug with a crack running down the handle like a vein. She didn't cry. She didn't dramatize anything, which is funny considering she taught theater. She told me that the dog had run out in front of her car when she was driving, and she had been unable to swerve in time. Her hands barely moved as she spoke. It had left the dog with just 3 legs, and Mrs. Whitaker's friend blamed her for it for years. The words were a knotted rope laid carefully between us. She didn't tug. She let me decide whether to pick it up. I told her about something I hadn't told anyone in that town. A playground fall in another country. An accusation that traveled farther than the truth ever did. That was the first time I noticed how her eyes sharpened on my name, as if seeing me on some private stage only she could watch. And then came my turn. The page returned like a season, like a bill. It arrived in the late-night quiet when a monitor becomes a light in a dark room, and it said my name with the same clean cruelty it had offered everyone else. It asked if everyone remembered the time I pushed Dean off the jungle gym in elementary school, and whether they could be safe with an attempted murderer like me around. Most people glanced off it. They didn't know Dean, didn't know the shape of that day on the jungle gym. Their skepticism was a mercy. But it wasn't for me. This is because I'd gone to elementary school, not only in a totally different area, but in a different country altogether. I'd spent my elementary school years in Canada and then moved to the States around middle school age. The rumor had never migrated with me because I hadn't packed it. Nobody, that is. Of course, except for Mrs. Whitaker. That was the hinge where the world bent. I made another appointment in homeroom. I told myself it was to ask the person who had once been kind to me for advice. Sometimes, the truth tells you what you were actually doing only in retrospect. When I said I knew, it wasn't a speech. It was a sentence that came out of me like a splinter I had finally grabbed. When I asked her, her face went weirdly blank, almost terrifying. That was the moment I realized the page had not been a room of strangers. It had been a room I had already entered, day after day, taking attendance. She explained it with a detachment that made me feel colder in the warmest room in our building. She said the posts were echoes, not inventions, the things she overheard and collected. I asked why, and the question was a key that turned in no lock. She said that if I told anyone that that blog was hers, she would terminate herself, and it would be my fault. There should be rules for the things you are allowed to put on a kid's shoulders. There aren't. What could I do but to agree to it? I negotiated the only price I could live with. I would only keep silent if she deleted that blog and never posted anything like that again. She nodded as if we were discussing stage props. The next day, the link 404'd into silence. 1 minute, it was there. The next minute, it was gone. She approved my transfer out of homeroom. She resigned at year's end. The page became a rumor about a rumor. I kept my promise, which is to say, I kept the wait. Now, to this day, I still have no idea whether or not I did the right thing by keeping Mrs. Whitaker's secret. I moved forward in time, but some part of me stayed in that classroom with the crack in the mug, listening to a grown-up ask a child to carry a bomb without a timer. It was pathetic, childish, and completely chilling when you think about it. And yet, I think about it. I really want to meet her again and just ask her why she did it, and also get her reassurance that she never did anything else like that to anyone else, or even worse. Years have a way of sanding names down to initials. Her name stayed sharp. I didn't grow up in a place where adults were villains. My parents argued with tax forms, not each other. The crossing guard knew jokes appropriate for every grade level. My teachers were the kind of people who brought granola bars for kids who forgot breakfast. When you are young, goodness is largely a scheduling phenomenon. Who shows up and who doesn't. Mrs. Whitaker always showed up. That's why the revelation was not just a betrayal. It was a collapse of a floor I hadn't realized I was standing on. People imagine anonymous gossip comes from someone spectacularly bitter, typing with dramatic malice, hating the world. In my town, it came from a woman who knew everyone's costume sizes. The account wrote in clean paragraphs. It did not use all caps. It picked details small enough to sound like facts. A date, an initial, the color of a backpack. It left just enough blank space for our minds to do the rest. We were good at finishing other people's sentences. When I say I knew it was her, I don't mean I had proof a lawyer would bless. I had a map of coincidences that circled the same address. There was the way she listened from the doorway, not to scripts, but to chatter. The paper cup of coffee in her hand in the hallway, the pause she took when a story passed, just long enough to tuck it somewhere. And then there was the one thing only she and I knew. The playground, the fall, the weeks of being called a killer by children who didn't understand the gravity of language. That detail appeared online without warning, like a ghost suddenly tugging at my sleeve. If anyone else had posted it, it would have been an impossible guess. From her, it was an awful kind of intimacy. The day I confronted her, I had planned sentences that started with "I think" and "maybe." I ended up saying 3 words. "I know. Please." Please what? Please stop. Please tell me I am wrong. Please be someone I can keep believing in. I don't remember choosing the chair I sat in or where my hands went. I remember her face going quiet, not sad, not ashamed, still, as if the expression itself had been wiped so the next one could be applied more carefully. If danger had a temperature, it dropped 10 degrees in that room. We talked like people drawing borders. She said she had never lied. She called it overhearing. I said overhearing has no publish button. She said people deserve to know what's said about them. I asked who had made her the courier. She didn't answer. Her silence wasn't defensive. It was empty. The kind of empty that invites you to fill it with whatever story you need to survive. I was a teenager. I filled it with the version that would let me get up and attend 3rd period. I want to say I threatened to tell the principal. I want to say I demanded she apologize to the people she had undone with her cool voice. What I did was smaller and more cowardly and more kind, depending on the angle. I made a deal. Delete it. Stop. Let the wound scar without picking it. She said yes immediately, which made the whole thing scarier. If you can turn off harm like a light, what does that say about the last 6 months you spent in the dark by choice? Her other sentence, about ending her life if I spoke, arrived like a trapdoor. I didn't tell anyone then, and I won't dress it up now. I believed her. In that moment, she wasn't a rumor merchant. She was a person asking me to carry a secret that might kill her if it spilled. The moral geometry gets complicated when someone hands you both the knife and the oath. I took the oath. I'm still not sure if that was a rescue or a surrender. The page vanished overnight. That's when I realized that anonymity isn't a mask. It's a door you can close from the inside. We all stood outside the empty doorway, blinking. Some kids said it had been a student. Others said it was faculty. A few said it was me, because quiet kids always seemed to be running something. The story of the story began to write itself, and because there were no new posts to feed it, it ran out of calories and fell asleep. She approved my transfer to a different homeroom with the brisk efficiency she brought to seating charts. She smiled at me in hallways with the precise warmth she offered everyone. She didn't leave me an apology wrapped in a metaphor. She didn't leave me anything. When she resigned after graduation season, the announcement read like the end of a polite party. She took with her the only proof I had that adults can be as casually cruel as any crowded lunch table. The proof of her presence. If you asked me what I remember most about her, it isn't the threat or the deletion. It's the day she taught us how to stand on stage without clinging to our lines. Find an image, she said. Something simple you can hold with your eyes. That year, my image was a three-legged dog looking back at me from a car's rear view. I told myself it was a symbol of survival. Some nights, I wonder if it was a warning about what we do to each other by accident and who gets blamed. After she left, a new teacher inherited the room. They painted over a scuff mark near the back wall. They replaced the cracked mug with a clean one that said, "Teach like a champion." The theater posters curled at the corners until someone took them down. The names on the call board changed. Time does that thing where it becomes efficient at cleaning. It missed one stain. Me. Certain, at an age when certainty shouldn't be possible, that monsters can wear staff badges. I tell you this, not because I want permission to forgive her or me. I tell you, because that was the year I learned a voice without a face can move furniture in your life. It can rearrange where trust sits, where fear sleeps, where your own name belongs in the room. Anonymity is not a blank. It is a tool. In the wrong hands, it is a scalpel slipped into a pocket and carried onto a stage before homeroom in elementary school in Ontario. Playgrounds were kingdoms made of ice in February. Dean and I were citizens of the jungle gym, princes of repetition. Up, across, down, repeat until the bell. The day he fell, the sky was blue in that cold, indifferent way winter skies can be. He reached for a bar, missed, and landed wrong. A crack, then a cry, then adults, then the way silence makes space for authority. By dismissal, the story had mutated. I had pushed him. Children can be scientists of cruelty, forming hypotheses with minimal data. The nickname stuck for months. It felt like walking under a sign only I could see. Years later, in a high school, the rumor slept in a drawer in my head. I didn't open it. I didn't say Dean's name. The day the account said it for me, I understood something about borders. We speak of countries as if they keep secrets apart. They don't. Stories cross without paperwork. They slip across in people. And sometimes, a person in authority stamps the passport, helps the rumor through customs, sits it down in a new cafeteria, and teaches it the local slang. I want to be precise about what that did to me. It did not ruin me. It did not end my social life. Most people skimmed past it because the details didn't map onto their map of me. But it emptied the room of air for a while. It made me move with care, made me quieter in a way I had thought impossible. It made me see the hallway differently. Every closed door became a potential echo. Every adult face became a surface I could not fully read. If you think that's dramatic, you've never had your childhood lifted and polished like an artifact on a shelf, while people you loved walked by and admired the craftsmanship. After the deletion, some girls pretended to miss the account. They called it thrilling, like a show that got canceled too soon. They liked the feeling of their names being dangerous. That's how I know the harm had been aesthetic for them. A shiver, not a wound. Some boys crowed about how it had all been fake news. They said that as if doubt were an eraser. Doubt is often a decorator. It just rearranges furniture so we can keep living in the same room. No one took away the chairs the account had added. We simply learned how to avoid stubbing our toes on them. I didn't tell my parents, not because they wouldn't have believed me, but because belief would have required action, and action would have detonated the deal I had made. It is remarkable the number of things teenagers keep to protect the adults around them. We think secrets are currency traded at lunch tables. Often, they are gifts we give upward. There's a practical question you might want answered. Why did she do it? I have guesses. Teachers overhear the weather of a school. They know who drifted from whom, who cried in the stairwell, whose hoodie smells like smoke. Maybe she felt powerless to fix what she heard and decided to document it instead. Maybe she thought she was disciplining us by mirror, holding up our noise to quiet us. Maybe she was lonely in a way that prizes information because it feels like intimacy. None of these guesses excuse what she did. They only prove how elastic motive can be when you're trying to stretch it over a deed to keep it warm. Sometimes I rewrite the confrontation with better lines. In those versions, she apologizes without being asked, and I refuse to bargain with threats. In those versions, I report her, and the principal becomes the adult I still believe in. In those versions, the page stays up a day longer, posts a final confession, and everyone learns the moral in time for finals. Then I close the browser on that version. I return to the one where I was small and she was smaller, and we both chose the way out that left the fewest lights on. I do not think she meant to hurt the dog. I do not think she meant to hurt the kids. I think meaning is often the least interesting part of a story like this. Results arrive regardless. And the result for me was clarity without comfort. Adults can be architects of harm without raising their voice. Harm can wear a laminated ID. Harm can hold the door for you at 7:55 a.m. and remind you to sign the attendance sheet. What I want, still, is not revenge or revelation. It is a conversation we didn't have. I want to ask, what did it feel like to hit publish? Did your heart race? Did you tell yourself you were balancing scales? Did you ever delete a post before it went live because the name looked too much like a child's? Did you make a private rule about never touching freshmen? Did you congratulate yourself on restraint? Did you know about the fight in the cafeteria before it happened because you had dropped the match and could count the seconds? Did you screenshot the chaos to show nobody? Did you sleep? It's easy to tuck all this into a box labeled "that one year" and pretend it's an artifact. But artifacts teach you about the civilization that made them. Ours was a small civilization built on buses and bells, governed loosely by adults with rooms of their own. In that world, power looked like the ability to print grades and excuse tardies. I had not understood the more subtle power to name from nowhere, to frame, to let a sentence walk into a room ahead of you and alter the air you breathe without ever revealing who sent it. When I talk about this now, people my age know. They remember different platforms, different flames. The particular's age, the mechanism does not. There is always a mouthless voice willing to be the room. There is always an audience ready to believe a sentence that doesn't shake when it speaks. In my worst imagining, she kept a file with all our names, lines drawn between us, like constellations only she could read. In my gentlest imagining, she threw the password away after I left her room and sat in the dark for a while, staring at a mug with a hairline crack, wondering what had cracked first. Something in her that should not have, or something in the world that made her think she needed to be the ledger. Years later, I tried to look her up. The search box felt like a familiar mouth opening for confession. I typed her name, then didn't hit enter. It's funny how much power the finger hovering over a key has. I tried different combinations: city, school, theater, alumni. I found a woman with her name in a different state who taught acting workshops to adults who wanted to use their voices at work. I found a fundraiser with a name that could have been her maiden one. The goal had been reached. I found nothing that felt like a door I could knock on. I rehearsed what I would say if I ever reached her. I would begin in the first person, because that's how you reduce the temptation to generalize harm. I was the kid who told you about the playground. I was the kid who made the deal. I was the kid who kept your secret, and kept it so hard it grew teeth. I would tell her that I don't think she is a monster. I would tell her that does not save her, or me, from what happened. Then I would ask the questions I have no right to answers to. Did you keep going somewhere else? Did you stop because of me? Did you ever say my name out loud when I wasn't in the room, just to see how it tasted? Free of the account's grammar? I want to pretend the point of this audit is forgiveness. It isn't. Not entirely. I don't know if I forgive her. I don't know if that matters. What matters is naming the mechanism, so I recognize it when it arrives wearing a modern skin. Back then, it was LiveJournal. Now, it would be a Finsta, a Discord server, a Notes app confession, screenshot sent to a group chat that includes the wrong person by design. The technology is just wardrobe. The plot is the same. Attention as oxygen, anonymity as mask, rumor as plot device that writes the rest of the story on its own. There are scenes I play again because they have useful angles. The cafeteria fight is one. Two boys performing possession of a girl, while the girl insists she belongs to no one. The whole play, directed by a paragraph a stranger posted. Another is the classroom meeting where I told a grown-up I knew her shadow's name. I watch my own face for the moment I decide to be complicit in something I hate. I watch hers for the microsecond before she chooses to hand me a burden. If I can catch that frame, maybe I can catch myself next time I am tempted to say a sentence that would be easier to say from nowhere. I carry with me her line about overhearing. I examine it like a coin. The obverse shows a teacher tired of being a trash can for feelings, tired of kids weaponizing whispers. The reverse shows someone seduced by the elegance of what can be done without raising your voice. If I am honest, I understand both sides. I have swallowed words until they scratched. I have also wanted to open a window and let them fly out, disguised as weather. What I hope, if hope is allowed here, is that she is somewhere now where harm is harder to do by accident, where her superpower is redirected toward a stage that can take it, where she teaches adults how to speak a hard truth directly and kindly, instead of curating pain until it looks like information. I hope the dog lived long enough to forget the sound of brakes. I hope the friend learned the complicated art of forgiving people for accidents without forgiving the accident itself. I hope the kids from my class who were shoved into the spotlight by that page have names now that no longer feel like weapons. As for me, I do the audit, and then I go to work. I send emails that say what I mean and sign my name. I do not post in rooms that cannot see my face. I am not a saint. I am simply a person who once held a secret hot enough to change my fingerprints. I learned that heat has to go somewhere. I let mine out slowly, into sentences that confess where I was standing when the building collapsed, and what I thought the tremor was before the floor gave way. When I can't sleep, I return to the simplest image she taught me to hold on stage. I pick a chair in an empty theater. I sit. The room is quiet in the most literal sense. No show, no audience, no lines. The door opens. A woman walks in and sits a few rows ahead. She does not turn. I say her name, and she answers without surprise, as if she has been expecting me. I ask her why. She tells me a story about wanting to know everything because she could fix nothing. I ask if she stopped. She says yes. I ask if she believes herself. She is quiet for a long time. In that silence, I realize that sometimes the only audit you get is the one you conduct on the version of a person who lives in your head. It isn't admissible in any court. It is the only verdict you can afford. If we meet, I will tell her what I know, now that I didn't then. Promises made under threat are still promises, but they age badly. Secrecy sometimes preserves nothing but the secret. Deletion is not deletion. It is a burial without a headstone. Memory is the cemetery where we read the names at night. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for your younger self is to say his name out loud without waiting for the echo to permission it. Dean. He fell. I did not push him. A teacher once put that fall in a museum and made teenagers buy tickets. I closed the exhibit. I kept the key. I still carry it. Anyone remember LiveJournal? Not as a platform. History has a way of rebranding carriage for the same old horse. But as a lesson, the lesson is this: a mouthless voice can teach you who you are by trying to ruin you. I am the person who didn't return harm with harm. I am the person who made a fragile bargain and kept it. I am the person who wishes he had been braver in the direction of sunlight. I am the person whose name, when said out loud, does not tremble anymore. And if she is reading this somewhere, in a room I cannot see, I hope she knows that I learned to stand on a stage and hold an image without looking away. Tonight, the image is simple. It is a cracked mug, glued at the handle. It can break again if you grip it wrong. That doesn't mean you refuse to drink. Story number 5. I used to think monsters were drawn with clean lines and bright colors. Then I learned the ugliest monsters don't announce themselves. They ask questions and take pictures. In the old country, love wears work boots. Grief smells like cold iron. And justice sometimes comes home with blood on its knuckles. They called him Lizard Boy, but the only reptile I ever saw was the man holding the camera. Some teachers grade homework. One teacher graded a man and marked him wrong with both fists. This isn't a ghost story. Not exactly. It's about the living who turn into ghosts while their hearts are still beating, and the dead who keep one promise after they're gone. I grew up on the far side of an ocean, in a country where cafeterias smell like citrus cleaner and the clocks are square. My father's country had round clocks and winters that bit without warning. The story I'm about to tell meandered across that ocean inside my father's voice, then nested under my ribs until I could hear the school bell of a place I never attended. My dad grew up in the old Soviet Union with his parents and siblings. The roads there, he said, turned to glass in winter, and kindness was a kind of contraband people smuggled in their pockets. His school was the kind of building that looked like a reprimand from the state. Tired bricks, frost along the windows, steam that didn't quite reach the corners. That was where there was this kid called Constantine, the boy everyone noticed before they tried not to stare. Constantine had a skin condition that made him scaly and a bit deformed. The rumors called it everything except what it was: a disease he didn't choose, a body that asked to be let out. He worked on his father's farm and came to class smelling like earth and smoke, carrying a pen he would sometimes not use because his lips couldn't form the words properly. And speech came out like a stitched coat, functional, not pretty. And yet he smiled the way tired people smile, full price, no discounts. Constantine was the son of a farmer. They lived hard and were dirt poor. The land took more than it returned. He rose before light and folded chores into his bones, then walked to school where the radiators talked among themselves and chalk dust lingered like a small weather of its own. Despite the hard work, early mornings, and late nights, Constantine still mostly attended school. He held his notebooks close, as if ink could warm the hands that the wind kept trying to own. Where I grew up, cartoons taught me that tragedy wears a cape. Back there, tragedy wore wool and stood in line. When I once asked my father if Constantine looked like Killer Croc, he shook his head and told me that reality didn't flatter horror with symmetry. Dad says he looks absolutely nothing like that at all, and that the reality of these types of skin conditions and deformities are a lot more tragic and unusual looking. He wouldn't describe more. Dad has too much respect for the kid to go into the details. Respect, where he came from, was a blanket you put over someone who had never been warm. He was a bit older than my dad by 2 years and was in the same grade as my uncle Vladislav. Constantine was Uncle Vladislav's friend and my dad's friend by proxy. Between classes, the three of them would share bread that surrendered more crumbs than flavor. They learned to keep eyes low and ears open, especially when men in tracksuits hung around the gates as if hunger could be satisfied by headlines. That's how the cameraman arrived in the story. No, not the man holding the camera, but the camera holding the man. Boris was the name attached to the lens. A self-portrait taken in swagger. Boris was a former gopnik who somehow became a journalist for the local paper. The local paper was far from reputable and mostly just published garbage. He courted a gangster's orbit and borrowed light he didn't deserve. He prowled the schoolyard like a rumor looking for stairs to fall down. Boris kept invading school property, and it soon became clear that he was trying to dig up dirt on Constantine. He asked children about the quote-unquote lizard boy, feeding them words like bait and waiting to see which of them would swallow. But the children refused to be his teeth. In that small mercy, I find something worth praying to. None of the other kids called Constantine Lizard Boy. The name lived in the mouths of adults in the town, men who drank courage from bottles and wore it like borrowed jackets. Boris dug, because that's what some men do when confronted with someone they don't understand. They dig for an ending they can sell. There was another adult who refused to look away. Mr. Kozlov taught chemistry, the one science that smelled like storms and second chances. The main rumor was that he'd been an illegal bare-knuckle boxer who served in the Red Army. He was definitely ex-armed forces and definitely a capable bare-knuckle boxer. His hands looked like they remembered promises. He graded on a curve that included decency, and if Constantine sat at the back to protect his own silence, Kozlov planted himself like a tree nearby and gave the wind someone else to bully. One day, Boris showed up with a photographer. Imagine how this wouldn't fly in the States today. A tracksuit wearing newspaper reporter and his idiot henchman with a camera trying to snap a photo of middle school kids. The shutter snatched at faces. Constantine turned away, and the lens followed him the way illness does. Impersonal, relentless. The class froze. In dictatorship and on playgrounds, the rules are simple. Whoever moves first loses. Mr. Kozlov moved. He met the lens halfway and treated it like a mistake you correct with both hands. He grabbed the camera, not a cheap piece of equipment in the USSR back then, and smashed it on the ground. The camera became a brief theory of gravity. The cameraman fled immediately. Boris did not. He squared his jaw in the way of men who've only trained for mirrors. Kozlov got a hold of Boris, though, and roughed him up so bad he had a bleeding nose and ear. My father says the hallway smelled like metal after that, and the floor learned a red alphabet. I imagine Constantine standing small and large at once, a boy for whom every day had been a fight, discovering that someone else could choose him. That night, the teachers stayed late and used soft voices that took the edges off the desks. They cleaned what needed cleaning and filled out the forms that let institutions continue pretending nothing had happened if stories ended where they should. This one would close with a broken camera and an unbroken boy. But Russia teaches endurance more faithfully than algebra. And men like Boris don't retire just because their noses learn humility. Boris kept coming back. He floated near the gates on days when the sun had no warmth to spare, talking to strangers, sharpening his questions until they were knives he could brag about. He tried to turn superstition into copy. Was Constantine a monster? A vampire? Something from a movie? He forgot the rule every scientist and every priest knows. Naming a thing badly doesn't change the thing. It changes you. A week later, whispers crowded the hallways. Rumors were swirling around the school that Koslov had been jumped while walking home from work. He arrived with a stiffness that made his coat look heavier than it was. He wouldn't say anything and snapped at them for asking. Silence became the staff room's second language. Everyone knew that Boris and his cronies were responsible, though men who write lies for a living eventually try to write with their fists. The school made a plan. I wasn't there, but the plan lives inside the way my father tells the next part, like verse everyone knows but pretends not to. The doors were watched. The corridors practiced becoming narrow. One day, Dad says that Uncle Vladislav claims he overheard the teachers talking. Koslov was saying that Boris wasn't protected now, and if he came onto school property again, they were safe to deal with him. Maybe my uncle embroidered, maybe he didn't. I've learned that truth wears different hats depending on who's coldest. Either way, Boris invaded school property one more time. Koslov and the other teachers were waiting for him. They beat him quite severely, apparently, and Boris vowed to be back and vowed that he would expose this lizard boy. It takes a certain brand of stubbornness to promise return to a place that just taught you the cost of trespass. Boris had it. He left swearing syllables. Nobody graded, and apparently they never saw him again. This is the first ending the story offers. A door closing on a man who specialized in opening the wrong ones. School went back to pretending it was only about books. Constantine went back to showing up with dirt under his nails and kindness in his eyes. He graduated with Uncle Vladislav. My father followed 2 years later. The world's most ordinary victories, a ceremony, a handshake, a step into a future that didn't promise anything but movement. Here the story forks. On one road, a boy who had fought all his life sat down to rest. Sometime after that, Constantine passed away due to complications from other health conditions he had. The poor boy had also had a hole in his heart and incorrectly developed internal organs. Despite his poor, simple upbringing, his funeral was standing room only. That day, the church became an inventory of what a town could feel. Farmers who never missed sunrise missed it gladly. Teachers who never cried ran out of handkerchiefs. Boys who had learned cruelty as a language found themselves mute. Boris, the reporter, was not there. On the other road, a different kind of ceremony prepared itself quietly. My family got ready to leave the country. Suitcases swallowed paper lives. Photographs learned to live in envelopes. Shortly before the whole family left for the United States, as winter reconsidered its options, a rumor learned how to stand up straight and dress like fact. A body was found in a shallow grave outside of town. According to the report, in the very paper that he'd formerly worked for, the body belonged to ex-reporter Boris. The article said little, as cowards do. It reported that the condition of his remains suggested that his skin had been partially flayed. Men in uniforms did their walking and measuring. Men with pens made their careful misdirections. Men at home nodded over soup and said nothing. I can hear someone asking whether I believe in coincidence. Boris had dated the daughter of a gangster, so maybe a debt came due. Maybe he pissed off the wrong people. Maybe this was history adjusting its chair. I was raised to understand that the world doesn't owe anyone a symmetrical ending. And yet, when Uncle Vladislav tells it, he leans forward and drops his voice the way people do when they're standing next to a grave. He says there was a conversation the week after Boris first disappeared. Kozlov and the other teachers talking about a job well done, about how Konstantin wouldn't have to worry anymore. The line between protection and vengeance is a thread you can only see if you tug it hard enough. Where I come from, it's impolite to pull at the loose ends of a coat a friend is still wearing. When I think of Konstantin now, I imagine the precise economy of his movements, how you learn to live in a body that resists you by noticing what never resists: the soil, the page, another person's need. The world gave him a map with wrong labels, and he drew a better one with his patience. He was an amiable and friendly kid who was popular with the others. Popular not because children are perfect, but because cruelty grows best in adults who water it with their boredom. I've met sickness that demands applause for its performance. Boris carried that kind. Boris is the other important main character in this story, but I refuse to grant him center stage. Every time he pointed his camera, he tried to erase a boy and replace him with a headline. He practiced a journalism of hunger: starve a village, then photograph the bones you made. He asked if Konstantin was some kind of monster, maybe a vampire or the creature from the Black Lagoon. That's the thing about superstition. Call it by enough names, and you start believing it owes you a favor. But schools, even tired ones, are built for defense. The wobbly desks, the chalk, the flaking paint, all of it teaches persistence. And then there are teachers like Mr. Kozlov, men who learned in other rooms that sometimes the only way to protect a child is to become an unfriendly lesson someone else won't forget. He walked hallways like a shepherd, weathered and watchful. Either way, Mr. Koslov was not a man you wanted to make an enemy of, and Mr. Koslov had a protective, fatherly instinct towards Konstantin. I think of the day he smashed the camera as more than a breaking. It was a translation. He took the violence aimed at a boy's face and rendered it into shards that could no longer see. There's a detail my father always skips, and I always add: the moment after, the quiet that felt bigger than the room, the way dust paused midair as if reconsidering its profession, the way Konstantin held his breath, then let it go, like a document he didn't need anymore. Protection, when you have lived without it, is a kind of disbelief, a miracle's shy cousin. A few weeks passed, and there were a few more attempts by Boris to photograph Konstantin. Why he was so obsessed with trying to run a newspaper story on a poor, deformed kid is anybody's guess. I, for one, think it takes a deep decay in one's soul to behave like this. Decay makes men impatient. He wanted a picture that would allow people to look without seeing. He wanted to sell a cruelty his readers could pretend was curiosity. But I guess that's what men like Boris are like. Decayed and warped. So the adults made their counter-story. No headlines, no bylines, no photographs, just the oldest editorial correction on earth. A boundary, a gate that looks like a man standing still, a hallway that narrows around a decision. I can't tell you what happened after Boris vowed he'd be back. My father can't or won't. When Dad is telling the story alone, he adds that he's not sure if Uncle Vladislav really did overhear this, or if he's just embellished things in the telling. There's a grace in leaving certain puzzles unsolved. It keeps the lesson from becoming an instruction manual. In the new country, I've learned to pronounce mercy without apology, but I keep an old country understanding of what it costs. You can hold a line for someone only so long before the line starts bleeding into you. I have seen men carry the weight of one necessary decision for the rest of their lives, convincing themselves each morning that the scale is still fair. After Konstantin died, my father says, his funeral was standing room only. I picture an aisle full of people trying to say with their bodies what they never managed with words, that he was more than nicknames, more than stares, more than pain. The room learned how to hold its breath again. The church lights did their best impression of summer. If grief is a ledger, that day the town balanced something. As for Boris, the paper that once paid him printed his epilogue in hard consonants. The body belonged to ex-reporter Boris. His skin had been partially flayed. The phrasing sounded like a man tiptoeing through his own house. The article offered nothing that could be used later in court. That was the final insult. To turn a human being into an ellipsis. I won't pretend satisfaction visited anyone that week. Some victories don't contain joy. They just remove one more danger from the map. It could be a total coincidence. He was supposedly the ex-boyfriend of a gangster's daughter. Maybe that math does itself. But Uncle Vladislav will swear to his dying day about the teacher's conversation. A job well done. Constantine wouldn't have to worry anymore. I don't argue with him. Some men carry truth like a relic. You don't interrupt the prayer they're saying, even if you don't know the words. We left for America, with our story packed between shirts. At customs, nobody asked us to declare it. On the plane, the cabin lights made the story look harmless. In our first apartment stateside, the radiator worked too well and startled us with its competence. We learned the price of fruit and the convenience of late-night stores. What we didn't learn, because no one teaches it, is how to stop measuring safety by how far a camera stands from a child. When I was small, I watched the Batman animated series and thought Justice had a theme song. One of the times when Dad was telling us the story, I asked if Constantine looked like Killer Croc. He said no, with that tired certainty he keeps for things that shouldn't be questioned. He looks absolutely nothing like that at all. He said reality is more tragic and unusual than any drawing will allow. He never saw Constantine again, and neither did I. And still, the boy sits at my table whenever conversation turns to what we owe each other. Who called him Lizard Boy? Adults in the town. Adults are the ones who name, and thus the ones who heal or harm. None of the other kids called Constantine Lizard Boy. Children can be cruel, but they can also be experts at seeing the person under the rumor. Maybe because they haven't spent as long negotiating with their own vanity. So what is this, if not a ghost story? There's a grave with a name in newsprint, and a grave with a name in candlelight. And somewhere in the overlap is a life that taught my father to be the sort of man who keeps another boy's dignity intact, even in memory. If Mr. Kozlov ever sat up late with tea, he didn't finish. Considering what he had done or not done, no one recorded it. If he ever walked past a mirror and saw both the Red Army and a classroom reflected back, who would blame him for turning away on certain nights? I imagine writing letters to the people in this story. To Constantine, I would tell him that the world is trying, clumsily, to become a place where kindness is louder than curiosity. That in another life, he would have had doctors who knew what to do, and farmers who taught him the constellations so the fields felt less empty. To Boris, I would tell him that his hunger forgot a basic truth. The camera is a promise to look honestly, not a license to devour. To Mr. Kozlov, I would tell him that some debts cannot be paid, only managed, and and that the ledger he kept may have balanced a boy's life for a little while. In the country where I live now, people like to ask whether the ends justify the means. It's an exam that never ends, with questions that refuse to stay put. I'm not sure justice is a balance sheet at all. Maybe it's a weather report for a place we'll never get to. Maybe it's just the decision, repeated daily, to put your body between a camera and a child. I've also learned that some stories carry their own warnings, like road signs. This is a story he and my uncle have told us many times. And every time, Dad stops before the part where certainty should be. He won't describe Constantine's skin. He won't say exactly what the teachers did. He won't guess whether the grave and the headline truly met in the same man. His restraint is the last kindness in the room. On the anniversary of nothing in particular, I sometimes pour a glass of water and leave it on the windowsill. Where my family comes from. You do that for the thirsty, for the ones who worked more than they were paid, for the ones the wind mistook for its own. I don't know who drinks it. A boy with hands that smell like soil. A teacher with knuckles like old plans. A reporter with ink he couldn't wash off. Or maybe no one. Maybe the glass is for me. A reminder that mercy is the only inheritance I'm willing to claim. And apparently, they never saw him again. Constantine and Uncle Vladislav. Then eventually my dad moved on from that middle school and went on to high school. Constantine and Uncle Vladislav graduated together, and my dad did so 2 years later. The rest you already know. The paper wrote what it wrote. The town said what it didn't. According to the report, in the very paper that he'd formerly worked for, facts arranged themselves with a care that sounded like fear. The condition of his remains suggested that his skin had been partially flayed. It could be a total coincidence. But Uncle Vladislav will swear to his dying day that the week after the disappearance, the teachers celebrated like men who had built a wall against a storm and found it standing in the morning. I do not resolve this for you. I place the story in your hands, the way my father placed it in mine, gently, the way you pass a sleeping child from one room to another, careful not to wake what would only be frightened by the light.